Hello, this is Pete the Tech Guy, and we are here for another one of our interviews with immigrants. And today, we're finally shifting to Europe. We've talked to people from Africa, we've talked to people from the Middle East, we've talked to people from South America, we've talked to people from the islands off of Africa, and today we're talking to Margaret Mary, I'm sorry, I got it backwards, from England. Margaret Mary, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure, Pete. Thank you for doing this.
All right, now, where in England are you from?
I'm actually from a little town called St Helens in the northwest of England, about 10 miles from Liverpool for people who don't really know.
Now, before we get to the other stuff, I understand that you knew a young man when you were younger who is a little bit well known today.
Yeah.
I think, what is his name? Mick something or other?
Yes. Mick Jagger was the next door neighbour of my godfather, so I knew him quite well when I was growing up and I was visiting my godfather. But amazing young man, very nice person, and does a lot for charity that people don't know about.
I suspect he likes it. That they don't know about it.
Oh, it's deliberate. It's deliberate. But no, came from a good family, and it shows.
Now, your father recently died. He was, I think, 91, 92, I believe.
93.
93. I was close. World War II generation. So you would have grown up in England, with tales of the victories in World War II. That must have been. I'm the son of a World War II veteran. It must have been something to hear about that, at least for the English point of view. It's got to be one of the high points.
Oh yeah, it's certainly very different. My father worked. He was in the intelligence corps, and he interrogated prisoners of war. And he didn't talk about the war so much because it was a very difficult time for people in his line of work, but his brothers, who were also in the army, they spoke about it quite a lot, and so many of our friends, it was just normal everyday conversation. It was not a nice time for anyone, but we're really grateful and admire what these people did for us and for the world.
Now, when did you come to the United States?
We came here on July 3rd of 1985, and our two young kids were so excited with the July the 4th celebrations. They thought everyone was celebrating their arrival in America.
Unlike a lot of the people I've talked to, you had 33 years in England, so you're completely, in fact, you're still a British subject, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, we've not... whilst we feel very American and do our best helping towards American politics, we are not actually citizens. Although...
Now, what made you decide not to become citizens?
Barack Obama. I'm sorry.
That's all right. You give any answer you want. But what made you decide to come to America in the first place? I mean, obviously you were 30. You're a young couple. You had young children. Was there something in England that just wasn't? Was it the job or?
No. When we came out of the Royal Air Force,
you were both in the Air Force.
We were both in the Air Force. Mike was working for an American company, and after a while, he was spending so much time over here in America that they asked him would he consider moving here for a 2-year period to start with, and we'd see how it goes. And that was 33 years ago, so...
it's obviously gone well.
It's gone very well indeed. As I say, we consider ourselves more American than English now.
Now, again, you came over for the job. Now, you'd obviously, if he was working for a company that was doing business in America, and both of you in the RAF, you must have dealt with American soldiers and such. Was America what you expected it to be?
Well, from my point of view, yes, it was. From our kids, not so much. our son thought it was going to be all Dukes of Hazzard land, and he was so disappointed when it wasn't.
You live in New Hampshire.
Yes, now. But we lived in Massachusetts the first 15 years.
You can't get less Dukes of Hazzard than Massachusetts.
Oh, you can't. But no, I love America and just about everything about it. We moved out of Massachusetts largely because of the politics, and we were finding we were becoming more and more Republican. And when we got friends in New Hampshire, and when we learned how involved you could become in politics in New Hampshire, well, it was a no-brainer.
Now, I find this interesting because obviously England, I've talked to people from England in the past and Scotland and the like, and they seem, I mean, obviously we don't do this really so much as a political interview, but they seem very far left compared to the leftists here. So if you were conservative in England, that must have been very early.
Well, actually, my husband and I was brought up strictly Labour Party. My grandfather was the mayor of the town several times, and we were encouraged to work at the polls from being about 8-9 years old.
The Labour Party being the party of the left at that time versus the Tories.
The socialists. But when I joined the Air Force at age 18, a friend persuaded me to go along to the Young Conservatives Club with her one night, and I was amazed, and didn't take too long before I became a conservative myself, to the family's horror. I mean, to the day he died, my dad kept saying, "Oh, your grandfather would roll over in his grave." But and then I met Mike, and when we got married, we were both working for originally the Liberals, because Mike was more liberal. But the Liberal Party in England is not the same as the Liberals over here. It's more, I suppose that's actually more middle of the road. So
Labour, which is far left, the Liberals, who would be the moderates, and the Tories, who would be conservative.
Yes, exactly. But we did become more and more conservative, and by the time we came to America, we were definitely conservative.
All right, now when I look at, when I'm thinking about this, now as you said, your children were disappointed that America wasn't all Dukes of Hazzard. Were there things when you talk to people who came to, obviously we're British, and you're still British. When people talk to you, when you met Americans, were their conceptions of England, were they totally off of, do Americans understand England at all?
No, they don't. But it's a two-way street. I mean, Americans seem to think that England is such a small place. If you know someone who lives in Plymouth, say, which is on the south coast, you expect them to know people up in Scotland, and they don't realise, what we're like. But people in England don't realise how big America is. My sister came for a 3 weeks holiday, and she thought she was going to have a day trip to Disney, a day trip to the Grand Canyon, a day trip to Niagara Falls, and she had just no conception of the size of the country, and this is normal.
Now, did it kind of blow you away? Did you get a chance to travel the country much?
Oh yes, I've been to almost every state in the course of our time here, and it's such an amazing country. I really love it. I really do. And as I say, I was expecting things to be different, so I didn't actually have any ideas in my head of what I thought it was going to be like, or how I thought things were going to be. I was just prepared to take what I found. And also it's how it helped me settle down and not get homesick. Because if I looked at it as, I didn't look at it at the distance away from home, I looked at how long it took me to get home. Because when we lived in the south of the country, it would take us several hours to drive up to see my parents in the north. And it takes about the same time to leave home in America and fly to see them in England. So if I looked at it in time instead of distance, it was fine. But
Now, have you traveled a lot back and forth between England and the U.S. during this time?
not a great deal. We couldn't afford it at the beginning, and we used to send the children back every summer for the school vacation so they could stay in touch with the family and grow up knowing the family. But I've been back a few times, but not for more than 5 years now.
Now, your children, how old were they when you came to America?
They were 9 and 11.
Now, one is no longer alive. Your son is, I think, in his 30s or 40s?
44.
44. Now, if he was he the 11-year-old or the 9-year-old? He was the 11-year-old.
Yeah.
So, he's being brought up in America, and he's coming back to England. Was his perception of England... I mean, he obviously had grown up in England for 11 years, had a particular perception. As he grew up in America and would go back for summers, it must have been a real culture shock in some degrees as the difference between America and England.
To some degree, but I think it was very good for him because it was able to balance his view of the world, and he became so interested in America that even though he's a very bright young man, he decided to become an over-the-road truck driver because he wanted to learn as much as he could about the history and the geography of the country.
Well, truck drivers certainly see all of America.
He certainly did, and it was very good for him. But
now, do your grandchildren get to England much?
no, we took our grandson once, but his father won't allow him to go with us anymore, but that's a family thing. And the same with the granddaughters. The fathers won't let them go.
Of course, these days...
The mother won't let them go.
Of course, these days it's a little bit different because when you first came, you didn't have, like, of course today you can have a cell phone and talk to someone in England and visit. And of course, when you first came here, you couldn't do that.
No, it would have been very expensive for them to keep in touch with their parents back here. But no, I know. I think now she's older, our older granddaughter will go over there and get to know people. But and our grandson would like to go back, but now he's not answerable.
Now, again, you're here in America. You've been here for quite a long time, but you've retained your British citizenship. When you look at America over the 33 years you've been here, has it changed for the better? Has it changed for the worse? Do Americans understand what they have with America? One thing that I've noticed is...
No, Americans do not not everybody. No, that's not, not everybody. But a large number of Americans do not appreciate what a marvelous country and what marvelous opportunities they have. This is such an amazing place if you take advantage of it and treat it properly. But so many of them are prepared to just complain about it and not make the most of it. And that really, it breaks my heart because, I don't know, there aren't many places in the world like this. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love my home country, but I wouldn't go back and live there. This is a much better place to live.
It's funny you mention that because the people I've interviewed, I've talked to people who have lived in countries that were dangerous, and I mean, people in Iraq. I'm glad to be here, safe and free. People from Cameroon, a gentleman from Cameroon, who talked about how there's some problems here, but he'd still recommend people coming here. And of the people I've interviewed, you're really the first one where safety wasn't an issue because you came from a first world country to another first world country. So. Yet the dynamic is the same in terms of how you talk about America as a place to come. Would you tell a young Englishman, come to America?
I would, and especially as things have changed now and safety is an issue in England. We are being overrun by Muslims, and the amount of violence in the streets and Sharia law is being implemented all over the place. We've got, we're likely to have our first Muslim Prime Minister shortly. Do you want me to take it? No. It's the Lord Mayor of London is a Muslim, and he's thinking of running for Prime Minister. And no, England is not the place it was a few years ago. It's not as safe by any means.
You know, it's funny because originally I was going to go on my honeymoon to England, but city travel messed up the travel plans, and we never got over there. And my concept of England, a lot of my concept of England came from the old movies of the 30s and the 40s, the World War II, the British Empire movies. And that England just doesn't exist anymore.
No, it doesn't, sadly. It really doesn't. And you see all these escapist programs on TV, on PBS, things like Father Brown and the Midsummer Mysteries, where even though it's murder and mayhem, it's very gently done and very nicely done. Not a bit like that. Not a bit, sadly. Really sadly.
Now, if there was one thing that you would say to someone in England about America that they don't understand about America and Americans, what's the one thing you think an English person or a Scottish person or someone near Liverpool needs to understand about America that they may not understand?
That we've got more freedom here. We really do have more freedom, although they're trying to take it away from us at the moment. You know, they're trying to narrow our choices and our ability to speak freely. But we definitely do have more freedom here, and we have to protect it. We have to make sure we keep it.
And what is the thing that you would tell an American if they want to understand the English and British people? If an American wants to, if there's one thing I need to understand, for example, about Britain of 2018 and the British people, more than how the country has changed, but of the British people, what's the one thing that an American should understand about the British people?
But quite frankly, a lot of them are very narrow-minded. Our press is nearly all what would be considered the left here. The perceptions of what goes on in America is so different, and they've become so narrow-minded, and I don't know, it's quite difficult to have an intelligent and sensible conversation with a lot of British people at the moment, because they're against us and our politics without even realising why. It's just because that's what the papers tell them and that's what they believe. And it's sad. It's very sad.
Now, you mentioned your husband had a job here, which is why you originally came. And you were in the Air Force originally, so obviously you're raising children, you're out of the Air Force. You ended up getting a job, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in the prison system. That must have been a shock.
Oh, no, I loved it. I went to the prison as being in charge of medical records there. And then after a few months, the hospital was privatised, and I did not like the company that was running the hospital services. But because I was working for the state, they had to find me another job, because I didn't want to keep the job with the new company.
Now, was this in Massachusetts or New Hampshire?
It was Massachusetts. This was MCI Norfolk. Thank you. And so they gave me a job in the Treasurer's Department, and that was a culture shock. I was actually working in a department with 13 other ladies doing all the things you do in a treasurer's office, all the buying and what have you for the prison and all sorts of things. And unfortunately, there was one lady who didn't get on with me for some reason, and she was one of the top dogs, and she took it into her head I needed punishing. So they sent me out to the canteen, it's called, which is basically the supermarket for prisoners, and that was supposed to be a punishment, and I was only going for 2 weeks. I stayed there nearly 10 years, and I loved it. I really loved it.
Now, this has got to be something a little bit interesting, because obviously we're talking about people who are in prison. You're talking about MCIs. So this is
serious crimes.
Serious crimes. And you loved the canteen. You were interacting with these prisoners.
Interacting with them, yes. But I was very strict. I demanded respect. I treated them with respect, but but I demanded respect. I wouldn't allow anyone to call me by my first name. I wouldn't call them by their first names, but I wouldn't call them by their number either. They were Mr. whatever. And the way I saw it was, I did not like the crimes they'd committed, but it didn't mean they were necessarily bad people. And, you know, take as you find. And in return, they were incredibly nice to me. I hate to say, I was actually more afraid of the prison officers than I was of the inmates. And the inmates treated me really well. But, as I say, it was all because of respect and keeping that barrier. And I tried to do what I thought was good for them. And I ended up starting a line, carrying a line of greeting cards for them, because I felt, just because they're in prison, why should the family suffer? So I ended up having greeting cards available for them for every occasion you can think of, even down to telling the kids what great kids they were and how proud they were of them. And it was one of the best sellers in the canteen. But it was only a little thing, but it mattered to them. It made them feel better. And from a selfish point of view, it made me feel better for doing something that they liked.
Now, did working in the prison system change your thoughts on prisons, prison reform, and stuff like that?
To some extent, yes, it did. Yes, it did. But MCI Norfolk was an unusual prison because it was the model prison initially, where they tried things out, and you had to be well behaved to be there. Any infractions and you were out. You couldn't stay, and people wanted to stay there because it was more comfortable. It was just better run. There were more opportunities. The libraries were particularly good for them. The educational courses available to them were really good. Lots of different religions were catered to there. But the thing that did disturb me whilst I was working there, was the number of young men who became Muslims over that period of a few years. One of my jobs was to enter up in the computer on a Monday morning new people, changes of names, any information. And I started noticing one or two, especially black young men, changing their names to Muslim names, and their religion to Muslim. And by the time I left, it was about 9 years later in the canteen, we were down, a couple of dozen a week were changing.
Now, did it change their way they treated you from what you were seeing?
To a certain extent, they became more arrogant. They were still pretty polite because I still treated them with respect, but the attitude to women was different, and that was very noticeable.
Now, you said you've been to almost every state in the Union. What stands out in the various states for you? Is there anything that stands out?
Well, I love California, but we lived there part-time for a few years, and I wouldn't live there now with the way things are. But even so, no, it's that's a great state. But no, every state has something special about it. I love Atlanta. I really loved Atlanta when I went there. We didn't see a great deal more of Georgia than that, but Texas is somewhere I'd love to see more of. I'm actually trying to persuade Mike to move to Texas, but I don't know whether that'll happen.
We got to shrink the house.
Yeah, well.
Honey, we shrunk the house.
Okay.
But he's saying, honey, we need to shrink the house. So
and then we can move. But no, I can't think of a state that's not got anything special about it. I love Rhode Island. You know, that I really feel at home there.
Now, the people in the various states, America's full of very different people, and you must have run into, and especially because you do a lot of political stuff, you must have run into just about every type of person.
Oh yes, yeah. And mostly the people you meet in politics are very nice, very pleasant. You may disagree, but that doesn't matter. But you can also run into, in life in general, you can run into plenty of rude people. And, well, folks are folks. Everybody's different. Everybody's, human.
Now, again, Americans have a reputation overseas. Is that, to what degree is that reputation about Americans valid, or are just Americans too different to pigeonhole because we're so large and so different culturally within the country?
No, it's different. It's difficult to pigeonhole Americans, really. I mean, people like the Texans have the reputation of everything being bigger and better than anywhere else, and that's quite a laugh, actually. But no, I mean, we're grateful for the help you gave us over the years. But sadly, I think at the moment, because of the press and the media, America is becoming more and more of a laughing stock, and that is very sad.
Now, does it deserve that reputation, do you think?
Well, I don't think it does, but that's my personal view. As I say, I think it's just because the papers are so prejudiced and they're so leftist that they're not giving a fair picture of what goes on.
If you had to say to a British person or a European person, to understand America, you should do what?
Read, and read widely, or get out and meet people. It's harder to meet people in a different country if you don't know, but if the opportunity arises, talk to them, find out how they think, what they feel. But I don't think anyone ever really understands another country without living there. I think that's the only way you can really get down to the nuts and bolts of what the country's like.
And would you advise, and I think we've already said this, but I'm going to say it one more time because this is a question I've asked every single person. Would you say to a young British person or a young European person of any type, come to America and make your life here?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I really would. I think it's the best thing we ever did was coming to America. I'd be very sad if for any reason we had to leave the country. I don't mind moving around the country, inside the country, but I don't really want to go elsewhere. But, apart from anything else, America's one of the few places that chases you for your money when you leave. You still have to pay them taxes even if you're not here anymore.
Well, you're not a citizen, so that might not be a case with you.
One of the reasons that we didn't become citizens as yet. Because as long as Mike's still earning, we don't want his earnings attached to, for two countries. So
that's right, because you'd still have the British taxes.
Yes.
They're not exactly small.
They're not exactly small, but at least when we come here, they're not taxing us. But
That's the key thing.
Okay, Michael is saying he can't, because you can't hear this on the microphone, that the British will not tax expats to the ends of the earth. So that's one of the advantages of being a British subject.
Yeah, I would agree there.
It just hit me. I did not ask you about the monarchy. The Americans have this thought of the monarchy as something very, very different, because theoretically we don't have a monarchy. But do Americans just not get it, or is the monarchy worthwhile?
Well, I personally think the monarchy is worthwhile, but even within my own family, back in England, there's split views on that. But I think they're very valuable to the country, and one of the main problems is in this country, a lot of what you know about the monarchy is from the tabloids, the National Enquirer and things, and they do not get it right. I mean, the things that really is fake news that Camilla is nowhere near as unpopular as they'd like you to believe. And all the silly stuff like Kate and Meghan hate each other. They're actually very close friends. The Queen thinks the sun shines out of Meghan, and they have a very good relationship already, even though it's only been a few months. Americans don't get the chance to really understand what's true about the monarchy.
Now, one thing I want to close with this. It's always been my contention that the two greatest things that ever happened to the world was Christianity, which established the concept of man's equality before God, and British common law, which established the concept of man's equality before the law. And while neither have been executed perfectly over the years, the British common law, thanks to what was the British Empire, is the basis for what's human rights today. And is that, as a Brit, is that a source of pride to you, to know that what is considered the best in the world came from that British common law?
It is actually. I mean, we've been very, very fortunate with our law system and the way it's evolved over the years. But no, we'd have been better off if it was written down the way the American Constitution is written down.
Your Constitution technically isn't written, is it? It's just traditional.
Technically it's not written, but it's. I think we've been very fortunate to have it, and there's a lot good come out of it, not just for England, but, as you say, for other places.
Without the British common law and the British traditions, we wouldn't have the freedoms we have in America. So on behalf of all of us Americans and on behalf of all the listeners, I want to thank you for that freedom, the freedom to interview you here, and thank you for your time, because I know you've had a busy day today.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pete. It's been a pleasure, and a one-off as well.
And final thing you want to say to the people who might be listening?
Well, keep on listening to Pete's show. He does a great job, and great guy with a wonderful family.
Well, I'm going to let people talk about like that all night. Well, I want to thank you for joining us for another one of our interviews with immigrants. We hope you've enjoyed it. And if you do like this work, if you think it's worthwhile, I would urge you to go to thetechguyblog.com, DATECHGUIblog.com. Hit the tip jar for whatever you can, because that's what helps pays for this. And if you've liked this interview, please go to our YouTube channel, where all of my interviews, from political figures to homeless people to whatever, are there. Playlists for everywhere from pinball arcades to religious activities, and of course my full playlist of interviews with immigrants. Until the next time, this is Pete the Tech Guy saying thank you very much, and you have a great rest of your day.